Hey guys, so this is going to be a really interesting video. It's going to cover a lot of different areas of Blender. We're going to use the excuse of building a fantasy character, and we're going to do it the easy way, so you don't even need any sculpting or modeling skills. And by the end of the video, you should have learned quite a bit to help you out with all your future projects. And if you'd like to support the channel, but more importantly, make your cycles renders massively faster, then you can get Turbo Tools version 3 from 3d-illusions.co.uk, or alternatively, you can join the members area where you'll be able to download so much cool shit that you'll instantly transform into the fonts. So back to the tutorial. There's a few good websites you can go to. Basically, we're going to get a 3D scan and we're going to chop the bits off the model that we want and make it into our own creation. Now, importantly, you've got to make sure that you get something that's CC0. It means the license you can do whatever you want with the model. A good website is 3dscans.com, but also if you just go onto Google and type in CC0 scans, and then you've got a load of links on here. And the one I'm going to be using is this one called Cultural Heritage, which has got 1,700 CCO scans. Let's see where this leads us. So we've got quite a few choices. We've got Arms Museum, but if we scroll all the way down to the bottom, we've got a link which will take us to the full CCO library. If you want to follow along with the same models as me, I'm going to put the link in the description below for all the individual models. And if you want to get the completed scene file, then that's going to be available in the members area that we mentioned earlier. Otherwise, have a browse through, find something you like the look of, and once you've found a model that you like, if you've got the GLTF format available, then that's going to be better because it means that the shaders are already going to be set up to have things like roughness. So if it's available, get the GLTF. If not, then OBJ. Extremely importantly for this tutorial, you need to make sure, because we're going to be doing some compositing, that you set the color management, if we go to the bottom of the render panel here, to standard. So by default, I think it's probably going to be on filmic, which basically will break the compositor. So very important, make sure you set that to standard and none, 0 and 1, and then you'll be good to go. Let's start by importing the first model using File, Import, choose the format you've downloaded, and then bring them in one at a time. Deselect, and now make sure it's only one model. So you can see here, we've actually got multiple parts that are made up of disconnected faces. So select it all, Control J, and that will join them into an individual model. And now we can see we've not got any outlines on the individual faces. In some cases, you might find that the join doesn't work, in which case, just select them all, right click, and then choose Convert to Mesh. If it still doesn't work, then that probably means that the object is parented. If you look in the outliner, you can see we've got an empty at the top. So if you just open this up until we get to the objects, these are the ones with the little triangles. Then we click on the top one, shift click the bottom one, and then in the viewport, Control J to join them together, and it should work. Next thing to do is go into edit mode, into vertex mode by pressing 1 on your keyboard, then M, and merge by distance. And that's deleted, well, that's merged 435,000 vertices. So that's reduced the model quite substantially. And if we come back out, you can see it still looks identical. Another beauty of using the GLTF format, as I mentioned earlier, is that it's automatically set this material network up for us, which saves us quite a bit of work. So the next thing then, we want to just get the parts of the model that we want to keep. I only want the head and neck, so I'll go into edit mode. Deselect everything by pressing A twice. And again, make sure toggle X-ray is turned on, and that will enable us to select all the way through the model. Select the part of the model you want. If you want to change the selection method, you can just hold your mouse down over here, or you can repeatedly tap the W key to scroll through the different options. Start drawing around the model. And then we'll do Control I to select the inverse, and then X and V to delete those vertices. And that will leave us with just that part of the model that we want. I probably don't need all this back here, so I'm going to delete some of this as well. So I actually want to rotate this a little bit so that the head is facing forward. So making sure I've got toggle X-ray turned on, I'm going to select the part of the head that I don't want to be deformed. Let's select all around there. I'm going to press the comma on the keyboard and set this to view, which means any transforms I make, such as rotation, will be relative to the view itself. And we're going to press the full stop on the keyboard and then make sure this is set to 3D cursor. Now, when I place the 3D cursor by shift right clicking on the model, that's going to be the pivot point. So I'm looking straight down. If I rotate now, you can see we're going to get just the head rotating, but obviously it's not the greatest result. We're getting a lot of stretching on the side there. So to make sure that doesn't happen, turn on proportional editing at the top there, rotate now, and you can see it's going to do it with a fall off. We want to try and get the minimum amount of stretch. So we can do it to about there, and then I'll press Ctrl plus to extend that a little bit, and I'll move the 3D cursor, shift right click, and I'll rotate again, and maybe decrease with the mouse wheel the size of that fall off, so we don't get quite as much stretching. And I'll just keep doing that until the head is pointing forward. Alright, so that's looking pretty good. It's facing forward, and the back of the neck, although stretched, we're not going to see it, so that's fine. What we could do is we could go into sculpt mode and just try using maybe the grab brush and just moving that around manually. We can change the size of the brush by pressing F and moving the mouse, and then just move things around until you're happy with the look of the model. With that complete, I'll bring in the next model. Now you can see the armour has actually come in absolutely massive. So I'm going to move it across to the side, and I'll select this chest plate, bring up the end panel, and we'll just check in the item section the dimensions, and we can see that this armour is actually 61.7 meters in width, 35 meters high. So it's much too big, obviously. So we'll select all of this, making sure we don't accidentally select the eagle. Just move it around to make sure you have selected it all. I want to scale this all the way down until it's a lifelike size. And then Ctrl A to apply the scale. And then I'll select all the objects and remove the parent. So I'm going to Alt P and clear the parent. And we can see the model has jumped off the screen. So we'll try again, but this time Alt P, clear the parent but keep the transformations. And then we'll just delete this parent object. And then just to make things easier to manipulate, we'll select all the objects, and we'll right click and just set the origin to be in the center of the geometry. So each origin of each object will be in the center of that object. I've just noticed as well, this has also got a parent. So Alt P, clear parent and keep transformation. And then we'll delete the empty down here. There we go. So what I want to do now is bring the eagle head inside the helmet. So let's move this up to about here. And I'm going to rotate it. Make sure to change the transform orientation and pivot points back. So I'm going to change it to global, and then the bounding box center or medium point. And RZ will rotate it around the world coordinates that we've just chosen to be the transform coordinates. Then we'll just continue moving, rotating and scaling until it fits in. And once you've got the proportions right, we can head into the sculpt mode and then start tucking in those bits that are sticking out. And then with the grab brush, we'll just drag in all the vertices that are sticking outside of the armour. And if you want to start manipulating different objects, then just come out of sculpt mode, select what you want, and then go back into sculpt mode as I'm doing here with the helmet. And I can see I've got a little bit of this helmet that's poking through the actual eagle's head. So into edit mode, I'm going to deselect everything. I'm going to hover over the bit I want to get rid of, press L to select the linked, and we'll go into isolation mode. Now to avoid selecting and deleting parts of the mesh I don't want to, we can press Shift H on the keyboard and that will hide all but the selected parts of the model. Forgot to turn X-ray mode on, so I'll just need to do this back part. And then Alt-H to unhide the rest of the model. I can see I need to raise that bottom part up a little bit more, so I'll reselect that part of the helmet again by pressing L, and then Shift-H again, and we'll go back into isolation mode for that part of the object. And one quite annoying part of this workflow is that you can't see the outline of the object that you've hidden, so you don't really know how far to move or to modify the geometry that you're working on. We'll turn off the proportion editing for this. Now I can move these freely by pressing G, or if I press G twice, I can actually slide it up and down the existing vertices, edges. And if we then hold the Alt key, we can slide it in the opposite direction. Anyway, somewhere about there. And we'll do Alt-H, come out of wireframe mode, come out of isolation mode by pressing / on the numpad. We'll just make a few final adjustments to make sure there's no bits poking through. So there's the first part of the model. What we can do now is just set up the world environment. So bring up your shader panel at the bottom. If it's not there, all you do is you hover your mouse over the bottom corner and just drag up like this. Change this to the shader editor and change this from object to world. And if I just maximize the viewport by pressing Control Spacebar, I can press Control Spacebar again to minimize it. It'll work on whichever one you hovered over. So let me just set this up from scratch. Shift A, S, and I'm going to type environment to add an environment texture. Plug this one in, and then make sure you've got the Node Wrangler add-on installed. Press Ctrl T, and this will add the texture coordinate and mapping node automatically for you. And then just navigate to wherever your HDRI is on your file system and choose whichever one you want. I'd recommend HDRI Haven, or I think it's called polyhaven.com. You've got a huge choice on there of different HDRIs. Okay, and once you've set that up, we go back to the normal screen, and then we'll look at the rendered mode. And if we have a look at this, we'll take a look at the material. So you can see on this armor material, because we've used GLTF, it's mostly set up for us. We've got the roughness and the color, base color, and metallic and things. And what we can do now is just start making some tweaks to it. We can add maybe Shift A, S, and an RGB curve and drop that in there. Now if we move the left-hand side one up, that'll make it rougher. And that's because the left-hand side represents the black areas of the input image. So if we move that up, it's making those areas white, which makes them rougher or less glossy. Now if we move the right-hand side one down, that's going to make the white areas of the input black, and so that makes the rough areas glossy. So there we are. So you can see that's looking really good, and with no sculpting skills whatsoever, we've got a really nice model starting to take form. Okay, so let's continue, and we'll bring in the next model. Now we can't see it. There she is over there. So deselect, and then reselect everything. Make sure it's all selected, and Control J. And that should make them into a single object, which it didn't. So what we'll do instead is just right click and choose to convert to mesh, and then we can do Control J and they'll all become one object. And we'll also remove the parent again like we did last time. Go into isolation mode, and I just want to cut out the parts I want again. But before we do that, we need to merge all the vertices that are so close together that they should be one. We'll do that by pressing M and then merge by distance. And you see that's removed 62,000 vertices. Make sure we're in X-ray mode, which we are, and I'm just going to select the parts that I want. So it's not as easy to select on this one. So we'll look at a few advanced selection methods. After we just select this first part, make sure I've got all the bits that I want. And I'm going to do Control I, X, delete the vertices, and now I can refine this selection more easily because there's less model in the way. And then I'm going to select a face. I'm going to go into face mode, select any face on the top there, or selection of faces on the top. I'm going to do select select linked and then linked flat faces, and then in the little redo thing down here, we can change the degrees, the angle that is classed as a linked flat face. So you can see that's made a good selection, and it's left out all the bits that I do want to keep. So I'm going to X, V, and I'll make a small cut down here. And I'll do the same over here. And now, if I press L over this one, it's going to select the entirety of that area that's linked. We'll delete those vertices. And I'll do a few. And this time instead, I'm going to do Control L. And that will select all the vertices that are on the same bits of geometry as the vertices that I've selected. So I'll just keep refining this. I'll probably go into vertex mode. So now I'm just going to select these loose vertices that don't have any faces connected to them. And we'll press Shift G to bring up the select similar, and then we can choose all vertices that have the same number of edges, which otherwise would be quite difficult to spot. And then press X and V to delete them. Have a quick check of your model to make sure you've not deleted anything important. And I'll just keep refining. Okay, so we've got the basic model now for this part. And I want to get rid of all these holes in the mesh so that we can remesh it in sculpt mode. Press A, select everything, and then we're going to do select loops, select boundary loop, and that's going to give us a few boundary loops. Press B and drag with the middle mouse button to deselect the bits we don't want, just in case there's any issues. And I'm going to press F to fill. So that's going to fill that in, and then we'll keep doing that. So select the boundary loops. Doing these all at once should probably work, so we'll try press F and that's going to fill them all in. And now what we're going to do is head over into sculpt mode and try and just tidy up this model so we're getting a better topology. So let's go into sculpt mode. Now this is going to mess up the UVs, but it doesn't matter because we're going to make our own UVs anyway. Bring up the end panel, and we're going to go into the tool section, and we just want to remesh this now. And we need to choose a voxel size. So it's difficult to choose a voxel size just by putting a number in there. What we need to do instead is press Shift R, and that will give us a visual representation of the size these voxels are going to be chopped up into. So let's go something quite small initially, somewhere about there perhaps. And then we're going to do Control R, and that's going to remesh it. And that might take a little while. In fact, there we are, pretty quick. And if we go into wireframe, we can see that we've now got, instead of that big face across the hole we created, we've got an even distribution of faces, which will enable all the sculpt tools to work much better. So we'll select the smooth brush, press F and drag the mouse to resize the brush, and then we can start smoothing these harsh edges out. Do that all the way around. I seem to have mutilated his gentleman part, sorry about that. Not going to operate correctly. And we'll just do Shift R again, Control R again to do another remesh, just to get a better distribution of faces so that the smooth brush works better. And now I can flick between the smooth brush and the grab brush just to pull it around so it looks a bit more natural. And we'll also start manipulating it just by grabbing it and dragging it around so that the feet are more underneath the body, just so it doesn't fall over. So just go around your model, doing the same thing on yours, wherever you think it needs to be tidied up. And when it starts going weird geometry like this, it means the topology is too messed up. So just do another Control R, and then we can smooth that much easier. Okay, so what we'll do now is start adding some texture to this model, because obviously it doesn't have any on it. So one of the big problems we're going to get when using texturing inside of Blender, let's go to the texture paint mode, is basically, if we look at the wireframe of this, this is incredibly dense. So if we try and texture this, Blender will undoubtedly crash. There's no two ways about it. Blender just can't handle texture painting over very dense mesh. Don't ask me why, it just can't. So we need to make sure we make this model a lot lighter. So how are we going to do that? Well, there's a couple of ways we can do it. The first way is to use the inbuilt quad remesher. So if we go into the data panel over here, you can see we've got this remesh area, and we can change this from voxel to quad. And what this will do is attempt to create a decent quad topology while still maintaining the shape. So it's going to reduce the amount of geometry basically quite substantially. To do this, it's very straightforward. Just choose quadriflow remesh, and then it'll give you some options. You can choose the number of faces you want. Set things like use mesh symmetry. Obviously, if your mesh is not symmetrical, make sure you uncheck that. Preserve sharps. If you've got sharp areas in your model, then you're going to want to check that. For example, if it's a hard surface model. Mesh boundary, preserve that. We don't have a mesh boundary on this one because we filled them in. And preserve the paint masks if you've set any paints on there, and smooth normals. It's very straightforward. I'm not going to use this one because I've actually got something better, which is the quad remesher from Exercise, which produces better results, but it's also much faster. But you can use the inbuilt one if you'd prefer to. So I'm going to remesh this, and I'm going to set it to 5,000 quads, should be fine. I don't need detect hard edges because it's not a hard surface model. Now, if I choose to remesh it, it's going to automatically create a copy over here. So before you use this one down here, make sure you duplicate the object so that you've got two objects, and then hide the duplicate, and then remesh the other one. That's just in case you want to transfer any of the data from the original onto the lower poly newer one. For example, I could add a subdivision surface modifier to the lower poly version that had just been created by the remesher, and then I can use a shrink wrap to transfer the data, or to transfer the higher resolution detail onto the new lower resolution model, as we can see here. And just by increasing the subdivisions, we'll get more resolution on the low res model to allow it to conform more to the tiny details in the original model. 2 should be fine. So let's just turn these off for now. And what I'm going to do is start texturing this. But before I do that, I need to go into edit mode, and I need to unwrap it. So with all the faces selected, I'm going to say U, and then I'm just going to do Smart UV Project. And that's going to create a UV map for us on this object, which basically means it breaks the model into individual pieces, and then it lays those individual pieces flat onto a 2D image, and then you can paint on that 2D image, and then that acts as a map to tell the render engine which coloured pixels go on which part of the 3D geometry. Because currently, to the best of my knowledge at least, there is no 3D texture format, so we have to store it in a 2D format instead. And after we've done that, we can go into the texture paint mode, and let's go into the material. Get rid of this original texture that came with the statue, and we're going to add our own texture instead. S, and then just type in texture, and we're going to choose image texture and drop this down here and plug this one into the base color. And I'm going to say new, and I'm going to set the resolution that I want. I'm going to name it first, and I'll call this horse body. I'm going to set the resolution something quite high so we get a decent result. Maybe 4096. That should be fine. So click OK, and now we've got this texture in here. We'll bring up the end panel into the tool, and you'll notice it says no textures. And the reason for that is because we were already in texture paint mode before we created the texture. So just go out of texture paint mode and then go back in, and then it will present you with the texture ready to paint on. So let's make sure we're in material preview. If we paint on it, you can see now we're getting the ability to paint onto the mesh, and it's going to go into this texture called horse body. Obviously, we're not going to try and paint individual hairs on the horse. That would take too long. So let's just undo this. What we're going to do instead is project a photograph onto the model. So that will give us photorealistic textures, basically. So what we need to do is firstly find an image that suits your particular model. For me, obviously, it's going to be a horse. So I've already downloaded an image from Google. And what you need to do then is go into the textures section, and we're just going to say a new image or movie, and then just open whichever image you've downloaded. And you can see that's come in here. And the next thing you want to do is just make sure it's in the texture area, not the texture mask. So let's close this one. We'll go into the texture area, and you can see the horse texture is in there automatically. If it isn't for any reason, just click on it, and then you can select the texture you want in there, and it will automatically stay in sync with the texture you've got selected over here as well. So with that done, you need to make sure you change it from tiled to stencil. If you hover your mouse over here, you can see we've got the stencil in the corner. If it's too dim or too bright, you can go down to the cursor section and increase the opacity or decrease it. And then to start moving it around, you've got a few options. Right click and shift to scale, right click and drag to move, and control and right click to rotate. So let's just change that opacity down a bit. I wish you could see the actual thing in the viewport while you're changing this. Really frustrating. But anyway, so let's change the scale of this. And by the way, make sure you download a high resolution texture, because the higher the resolution the image that you're projecting onto the mesh, then the better quality results you're going to get. And it's also easier to paint that way as well. Also, importantly, make sure you only paint onto the parts of the mesh that are facing directly towards the camera, because if you accidentally paint on the glancing side of the object, you're going to get stretching all the way along it. And we can use the colour slider as well. This acts as a multiplier, so if you set it to full white, then you're going to get the same colour as on the photograph. But if you turn it down to black, then you'll get it the same colour on the photograph, but you'll get it much darker, which is useful for things like the hoofs here. Okay, and once you've done a reasonably decent job and you're happy with the result of your texturing, what we'll do is create 3 materials, all using the same texture that we've just painted. One for the hooves, one for the body, and one for the tail. And then we're going to actually paint those materials onto the body itself. So there's a few different ways we can do this, and we'll look at 2 today. The first method, we'll start by going to the data panel, and you can see we've got no attributes either in the vertex colors or in the attributes section. So we'll go select the model, and we'll go into vertex paint mode, and we need to make sure we can see the vertex colors in the viewport. So turn it into solid viewport shading mode, and make sure we change it from materials to attributes. And then when we start painting, those vertex colors attributes will appear in the viewport. There we go, we can paint on this now, and then this is going to give us this color attribute. So I'm going to name this, I'm going to call this one hooves. So let's just make sure we set this back to white, and just cover that white again. So let's go into the shader editor, Shift A, S, and then we're going to drop down an attribute. So when we drop down an attribute, you can see we've got the option to choose between geometry and object, and we need to name this attribute the same as what we've called it over here. So we'll call it hooves. Now, if we look at this through the viewer, and we'll go into material mode, let's go back into vertex paint. I'm going to set this to black. And if we start painting now, we're actually painting the attribute directly in the viewport, because we've got the attribute node connected to the viewer node in the material. If we change it back, then obviously we're just going to get the base color, the BSDF, instead. So just swap it back again. Now at the moment, obviously we can only see the attribute, and we want to be able to see the texture as well, so that we can make sure that the attribute lines up to that hoof texture. So in order to see both, it's quite straightforward. What we'll do is we'll put this one back in, and I'm going to Shift A, S, and I'm going to do a mix RGB. I'm going to drop this in between here, and I'm going to make this one red. I'm going to put the factor into the factor here. And this means that the white areas of the attribute are going to get the bottom slot, and the black areas of the attribute, so 0, are going to get the top slot. So we'll just swap those over. And then if we set this colour back to white, we can start removing the bits we've painted by accident until we get to the area on the texture where we see the hoof. Now, we've got a bit of an issue, as we can see here. The attribute itself, the red areas, are not flush with the edge of the hoof. And this basically is because there's insufficient geometry. We could cut an edge all the way around the texture, but that's just not an ideal solution. So what we'll do, we'll look at an alternative method, which will avoid that problem completely. So what we'll do instead is actually use another texture rather than an attribute. So let's just disconnect this one. And this time, I'm going to create a new image texture, drop this one down, a new one again, and I think we'll go with 496. I'm going to call this hoof mask. I'll click OK. And one thing you need to be very careful of is on your images. Let me just go to the, let me bring an image editor up. This is one of probably the most annoying parts of Blender. You can actually lose all your work. You know, if I was to close down Blender now, even if I saved it, I would lose all these textures that I've painted. So what we need to do is go to the image editor, and you can see we've got a little star next to this image, which basically means if we don't save the image separately, it's going to be lost regardless of whether or not we save the file. So for me, this, if I do File, Save, then that should save the edited image into the blend file as a packed image. It shouldn't overwrite the original on disk, but it should definitely save it so you can't lose your work. So anyway, we're going to do Image, Save, and it's going to ask us a place to choose to save it. So I'm going to put this horse body PNG, just put it in there, that's fine. And now that's been saved, and we're not in danger now of losing that, even if Blender crashes. Alright, so we've got this new one now, hoof mask, and basically this is going to be the same as before. So we're going to plug this one this time into the factor. I'm going to go into texture paint, get rid of this. So because we had the texture selected in the material before we went into texture paint mode, it's automatically selected to paint on. And as I paint it, just to pay attention over here. So let's just remind you what I've done. The hoof mask is now controlling this factor instead of this attribute. So as I paint the image now, we're going to get the image back. So I'm going to paint it in, it's currently black. So that means anything that's black is going to be getting the top one. So I want to just invert that. And now, as we paint white onto the texture, the bottom slot is going to become visible in the viewport. And that's going to be the red, as we can see here. And because we're painting a texture rather than painting the actual vertex colours, the geometry, the underlying topology, no longer matters. We can just paint precisely up to the edge of this hoof texture, and there's no problems whatsoever. What you could do, by the way, is go into View and just turn the end clip right down until it starts getting rid of stuff in the background. And then, I believe, hopefully, that I can paint on anything and it won't go into the background. But unfortunately, no, that's not the case. So ignore that. That's what I expected, but wasn't the reality. And if you do a bit too much, we can just change this to black. There we are, we can undo that. So there we are, that'll do. What we're actually going to do is, obviously we're not going to make it red, this is just to make it easier to paint. So I'm going to do the tail now as well. We'll get rid of this one. Make sure we save it. Hoof mask, that's fine, save that. And now we're going to create another one, and we're going to call this tail mask. We'll plug this one into the factor, make sure it's selected, and we'll go into texture paint, and you'll notice the new texture is not there. So that's because we're already in texture paint. So go out of texture mode and then go back in, and then the texture should be available in the top. I'm going to start painting until this is all red. And there we are. So we've got the tail mask now. I'll save the file, and then I'll also make sure I save the image. And now these are saved into the file system, so we can't lose them. The next thing to do is create 3 shaders inside of one material and then mix them together using the masks we've created. Is Shift A, S, I'm going to put down a mix shader. So I'll drop this one down, and this is going to work identically to the mix RGB, but the only difference is it's going to mix 2 shaders rather than 2 colours. I'm going to put that tail mask in there. We'll get rid of that now. So because we've got no material plugged into the bottom of this mix shader, this tail itself is getting no material at all. So we'll just copy this one that we've already got, and we'll plug this one into the bottom. And now the tail is going to get that BSDF rather than the top one. And if we set the viewport to cycles rendered mode, we can start making changes to this tail material without affecting the rest of the horse. So I'm going to maybe add an RGB curve. We'll make it a little bit darker, somewhere about there. And I want to give it some subsurface scattering as well. So turn up subsurface scattering. We don't want it to be red. So we're going to go into the radius. The values stand for RGB, so set them to 111. I'm going to plug the colour from this into the subsurface colour. And then control the amount by just turning this down. And we change the distance by changing these to 0.01 or something like that, just to make it not completely destroy the fine details. And what I want to do as well is add a normal. So Shift A, S, I'm going to put in a bump node. I'm going to plug the colour from this into the height, and then we're going to plug this in normal into the normal of the material. And now if we zoom in, we can see that the geometry now appears to be sticking out, so it's quite lumpy. It's a bit too much though, so I'll reduce this to 0.2, maybe 0.5. I'll probably turn the roughness down a bit, perhaps not too much. In fact, no, we'll leave it all the way up. And we're just going to play with the settings now on the materials until we're happy. Take both of these. I'm going to plug this one in Shift A, S. I'm going to do a mix shader again. So the hooves one, I believe, is this one. Plug this colour of this one into the factor of this one. Now the hooves are going to turn black. And then we're going to copy this material. Makes ourselves a bit more space first. And get these ones. Shift D to copy those. Now plug this one into the bottom. Now the hooves, I don't want subsurface scattering, so I'm going to turn that off. I want these to be shiny, and I want that bump to be much less. So I'm going to go with 0.1, somewhere maybe even 0.01. 0.052 is a good one. That's probably a little bit too shiny, so let's just turn that up a bit. Just until it looks how you want. Then the last one is going to be the horse body. So we could use the principal BSDF that we already mixed in with the horse tail, but just to show you an alternative method which is quite useful, we're going to do it by adding another one. So let's create another one of these mixed shaders, and this time we're going to create a third mask by adding the other 2 masks together. So let's just duplicate these 2. Shift D. Scale those in so they get close together, which is really cool that you can do that. I want to add these together. So Shift A, S, mix RGB. I'm going to change this to add. I'm going to take this one. I'm going to take this one. Make sure it's set to 1. I'm going to plug this into the factor. Now you can see everything apart from the horse body has gone no material. So we need to put this one into the bottom. And now just the horse body has gone dark, indicating it's got no material. So what we'll do now, copy this again. Plug that one into the top. And we'll start playing around with the roughness and the bump and the colour. Maybe give it a little bit of subsurface. And there we are. So I've not done a majestic job for the tutorial, but this is how you'd basically paint a texture on and then mask the different areas, so you can give each of those different areas a different shader within the same material. So let's come back out of rendered mode, and once that's done we can unhide everything else. So I'm going to come out of isolation mode by pressing / on the numpad, and we're going to align this horse now to the rest of the body, just using the same tools we've used previously, such as setting the origin to the geometry. And now if we have a look at this all together, you see that's quite an interesting looking monster. So we just need to do the arms now. Then we'll set up a render, and we'll also look at doing some compositing as well, which should be really interesting. So I'll just bring in the arms. We'll just do all the same stuff we've done previously, such as joining it together, merging the vertices, and then chopping off the bits that we want. So now we go into edit mode, and we'll do L, and that will select the entire arm now that we've merged those vertices. I'm going to P to separate the selection, and I want the origin to be sort of in the middle of this hole. So I'm going to do edit mode, A, select the boundary loop, Shift S, and I'm going to say cursor to selected. That's going to put the cursor in the middle. Come out of edit mode, right click, I'm going to say set origin to 3D cursor. Now, if I rotate, it's going to be the origin is based in the middle of this hole. So let's move this into place. And I wasn't going to have massive long arms, but I think that looks pretty good actually. What should I do really small arms? What's that like? Small or massive? I think small looks a little bit too T-Rex-like, so let's bring that back up. And then we'll do the same for the opposite arm and put that into place. And just tidy up any bits that are poking through by deleting them. Alright, so let's go into sculpt mode. I'm going to try out this pose mode. I've not really tried it much in the past. So I might have to look at the instructions. Yeah, I'm definitely going to need to look at the instructions. Or, I mean, why is that? Let's just go segments. Let's go with 1. So I want it to go all the way to the elbow. How do I do that? There we are. Oh, there we are. Easier than I thought. There we go. I'll do the same over here. Select this arm now. Oh, much easier than I expected. Can I rotate it somewhere? Oh, control. Well, it's a bit of a harsh fall off there though. How do we make that fall off less harsh? Smooth iterations, is it? Try that. Oh yeah, look at that. That is pretty good. We'll just manipulate the chainmail as well, just so it's not penetrating through his arm. I think I'll get rid of the one inside. And I'm going to get rid of that in render and view. Right, so we need to bring up the shader editor. Select these two arms again. I'm going to make them 1. And we're going to go into rendered mode. And let's give these more of a skin colour. So I'm going to make sure we turn on a bit of subsurface. And the roughness. So the roughness currently is based on a statue. Obviously we're not using a statue, so we're going to get rid of that. We'll put this to more of a skin sort of roughness. Ideally you would paint the different attributes of the skin, such as the roughness and the bump and things, but for the tutorial we won't do that. And then we'll tweak the base colour by adding an RGB curve and just manipulating things like the brightness and a bit of contrast as well. And if we wanted to, we could edit the texture for the arm. But just before I do that, I just want to check I've saved all the images so far that I've created. Now, we're not only limited to painting on textures that we've created inside of Blender. For example, if I want to tidy up this texture that's come with this GLTF, I can actually edit that by selecting the texture and going into texture paint mode. And then using the available paint tools just to tidy up the texture. Be sure to disable any masks that you've got enabled as well. What we could also do is go into sculpt mode, and we could just maybe crease this a little bit, get those a bit closer together, and maybe in fact just bring those down a little bit as well. And use the control key to subtract clay instead of adding it. And then I'll use a combination of the clay brushes, the grab brushes and the crease brushes just to make these fingers look a little bit more as if they're not one solid piece of pottery. I think I'll call that it for the character. Let's just have one quick look at the render. I think the tail looks a bit crap, so let's put proper hairs on it instead. So we'll start by selecting an edge loop so we can chop the tail off. And we'll do that by Alt left clicking on one of the edges until we get one that goes all the way around. Go to select, loops, and I'm going to select inner loop region. And you can see that's going to select all the way to the end. Press P, I'm going to say separate by selection. So this is now its own object. I'm going to name this to give the separated tail a name and then hide it, just in case it might come in handy in future. Then we'll go into edit mode, select this boundary loop for the hole, and just press F to fill that in. I'm going to select this new face, P, selection, then name it hair emitter. Move this inside the object, so GY. And if you're going to animate it, you would parent it to the body, but we're not. What we need to do as well is cap this hole. Select this object, go into edit mode, edge mode, select this border by Alt left clicking on this edge, and this time we're doing a grid fill. So Control F to bring up the face menu, and we're going to choose grid fill. By the way, you've got Control E is the edge menu and Control V is the vertex menu, just in case you're not aware of that. And what we want to do now is smooth this out. But before we do that, we're going to unwrap this. So we're going to do U, and actually let's go to the back out of full screen mode. We'll go to the UV editing window. U, Smart UV Project, just the selection, and then OK. Now the problem is, you'll notice if we come and look at the UVs, it's covered all the other areas. So we're going to get all the mask and the texture data from the other parts of the model inside this area. So we need to make sure we put this into an area of this UV space that's not yet used. So let's just for now shrink it down. We'll move it somewhere over here, completely out of the way. Now if we come in here and select everything, we can find a gap. So let's now go back to this, and then we'll move it into an empty space. Go back to the layout workspace, and I want to smooth this area out a little bit. So back into edit mode, I'm going to select this area by hovering over it and pressing L. And then can we do this based on UVs? Yeah. So that's selected based on the UV island. Number one, to go into vertex mode, Control plus a couple of times, maybe one more. Right click and then smooth vertices. And then we can change the repetitions until it looks smooth enough. So that looks pretty good. go back into the material. So we need to make sure we choose the horse texture, which is this one, horse body. And then we'll go into texture paint mode. And now we can start painting that horse. Now, I have noticed that this texture is rubbish. It's too low resolution. And stupidly, I downloaded 2 horse pictures, and I've chosen the one that doesn't have the highest resolution. So I'm actually going to quickly repaint this area. Before we do that, I'm just going to simplify the material on the horse because we don't need the tail in there anymore. So all we need is actually to get rid of the first part. This is the tail and the horse body shader that we didn't actually use. And we only need one mix shader to mix the hooves and the body. So we can get rid of this first part. We'll plug this into the material output instead. And that'll leave us just with the hooves material at the bottom there. So let's select all this and put it into a frame. And name the frame hooves. Then we'll select the body part of the shader. We'll plug it into the top, frame it, and then call that body. And you can see now we've got a much simplified material with just consisting of the hooves and the body, separated by the hooves mask. And if we come back out of full screen mode, we can have a look and the material should look identical to how it did before. So I'll just very quickly repaint the horse body. There we are. I think that's a bit of a better result. So let's go back into object mode and we'll start adding the tail. We're going to go into the particle properties and add a new particle system. Change it to hair. And obviously that's way too big, so let's change the size down a bit to about here. And we want to go into particle edit mode. We'll start brushing this around. Make sure as well in the tool settings that you turn the path steps up a little bit to 9 or 10, just so you get adequate resolution. And we want to get this tail so that it's on the floor. So let's go into side view. We'll bring that down a bit, and it probably needs to be a little bit longer in fact. So change the length about there. I want to get it so it's sitting on the floor, so the same line as the feet. I'll bring that down a bit. And just comb it until it looks good. Let's go into rendered mode and we'll add a material so that it renders correctly. And we'll go into the material settings. We'll get rid of this one. We're going to create a new one and we're going to give it a principled hair. So get rid of principled BSTF, Shift A S, principled hair. And we'll plug this one in. And now you can see we're getting the hair. But there's not really enough of it. So we'll go back to the particle settings and we'll add some children to bush it out a little bit. And we'll go into the particle settings and you'll notice it's lost its resolution in this area. That's because we need to go down to the viewport area and just change those strands up. And we'll do the same for render as well. Alright, so we need to add some children. We'll go with interpolated and we'll set the display amount to 20 and we'll set the render amount to 20 as well. What I'd also like to do is give the hair a little bit of random shape, and we can do that if we go down to the roughness section of the particle properties. And we'll turn the uniformity up a little bit and you'll see it starts becoming a little bit more interesting. We can probably change the size. And obviously that's way too much. We can change the uniformity to 0.1. Increase that size. And just play with the settings basically until it looks good. I think that should be fine. One thing I do notice when I've been moving things around, I've made these testicles sort of defy gravity. So that very importantly, your testicles must never defy gravity. So I'm going to come in here. What's the best way to move these? I think I'll just select 2 of the pinnacle points of these testicles. I'm going to turn on the proportional editing. We need to make sure it's connected only, so that we don't accidentally move his leg around. And then if we move these on the x-axis, on the y-axis, which axis is it? Should be the y, I think. GY. There we are. I want to limit it to the testicles, obviously. So about there. There we are. Now they're hanging more. They're hanging more naturally, I think is fair to say. Let's have a look, and we'll go into rendered mode. Yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. All right, then. So let's add a ground plane, which we'll use as a HDR, as a shadow catcher, basically. Very straightforward. Come out of full screen mode, and we're going to add. Let's come out of this mode. In fact, we're going to add a plane. So I want the plane to be level with the bottom of the feet. So I'll just put the 3D cursor there by shift right clicking and shift A, mesh plane. I'm going to scale that up a bit. Then we'll move it around and scale it until it's long enough to catch the shadows, and make sure we apply the scale as well. And very importantly, what we need to do is make sure the texture on the plane matches the colour of the ground. Otherwise, we're going to get weird results. And the easiest way to do that is just to add a new material and make it, if you choose the colour picker, make it roughly the same colour. Just turn the roughness right up, or the specular right down. And now we could go into the section over here and turn on shadow catcher. So that's the easiest way to do it, but it does come with quite a few limitations. For example, we can't light up the ground. The reflections from the ground onto the model will be incorrectly placed because they'll be from far away. We can't get coloured reflections either, and there's quite a long list of problems. We can get around it using the shadow catcher pass, but it won't solve all those problems, and we can't see it in the viewport either. So we'll look at two alternative methods now, which will give us massively better results. Making sure the ground is selected, we're going to go into world mode and select these two items here, the HDRI and the mapping. I'm going to put those into a group. I'm going to call this group world. I'm going to copy this group. In fact, I'll copy these two nodes, Control C. We'll go back to the object mode, Control V. I'm going to plug this into the base color. We need to change this from generated to object. And that means the texture will be projected from the object's origin onto itself. And then we can use the origins to move that up to a position similar to that the camera was in when it took the HDRI. But the result, as we can see, is not perfect because the edges of the plane don't match up with the actual HDRI environment that we're seeing in the background. And also because the tone isn't quite the same, which we can fix by dropping down an RGB node and firstly remove some of that blue tone that has been cast by the sky. So go into the blue area and I'll just bring that down a bit. So it becomes more of the same green, and then go to colour, and I want to reduce that strength a little bit so that it matches as well. So that's one way you can do it. And if we make this plane big enough, for example, if I scale this right up, right, make sure we come out of origin. And you'll probably notice that because we've moved the origin away from the face of the plane is actually scaling away from the original place. So what we need to do instead is use the 3D cursor as the pivot point. So if we press the full stop key on the keyboard, then we'll set it to 3D cursor. And now if we scale, it will stay planted to the original location. So that's one way you can do it. And just tweak it until it fits in properly with the background. So about there. And that looks good, and it will also allow you to move the camera around the 3D object, and the 3D object will stay planted into place. But if you're only doing a still image, like I'm going to do here, then you can use an alternative method by adding a camera. Control 0, 0, Control 0. That will align the camera to the view. And let's just come out of camera mode a second, so we can see the camera. Right, camera selected. Shift S, cursor to selected, and now we've got the cursor here, and then Shift A, and we're going to add an empty. We use plane axis. I'm going to make the empty follow the camera position using a constraint. So we're going to the constraint section. I'm going to add a copy location. I'm going to use the target as the camera. And now, whenever I move that camera, this empty will follow it, but it won't rotate, it will just follow it. And that's what we want. We'll go into camera mode and make sure we turn on, under the view menu, camera to view, back into camera mode. Now when I move the camera, you can see the empty. If we bring up another 3D viewport, if I move the camera, you can see the empty in the bottom is moving along with it. So let's bring back up the shader editor, and we'll change the shader so that instead of using its own origin, it's going to use the origin of that empty instead. And that means it will always project from the moving point of the empty. And the empty, of course, is always going to be in the same location as the camera. And because the world environment is projected from the camera, that means the texture on the plane will always match up with the world environment. But if you rotate the camera now, you can see that the object doesn't stay planted to a specific point on the ground. But that's fine because we're only doing a still image. And don't forget, the higher the resolution of the HDRI image you're going to use, the better result you're going to get. And if you want to rotate the HDRI environment, because we've put it inside a group, we can actually rotate it inside the group, and that will affect the rotation not only in the world, but also the texture on that plane as well, making sure that they always match up. So what I'm going to do now is have a quick browse through some different HDRIs just to see if I can get a better looking image. At the seaside. Let's try this one. 1K. Oh dear. That is small. That's what she said. So this one looks pretty interesting, but the problem is, if you look, you can just make out the edge of the plane. It's darker blue than the wall at the background there. And to avoid continually trying to fix that using the RGB curve, what we'll do instead is give it a transparent fall-off so that it transitions gently between the plane and the HDRI environment. So back to the plane material, and we'll come out of the group. We'll do Shift-A, S, I'm going to put down a gradient. We'll change it to a spherical gradient. We'll then duplicate the texture coordinate, and we'll get rid of that empty. Plug in the object into the vector, and then the factor into the alpha, and that gives us this little sphere at the origin of the object. So let's scale this up a little bit with the mapping node. Shift-A, S, a value. We'll plug the value into the scale, and then we can control the size of the area that's not transparent by increasing or decreasing the scale. Now, don't worry about it having a harsh edge. That's just in the material preview mode. If we change it to cycles, we can see that we no longer get that harsh edge. The problem is, though, it's quite difficult to see. Even if we scale it up and down, we're not really getting much of an effect. So we'll drop down a ramp node. And if we drag the black to the right now, that's going to change. It's going to shrink the size of the white area down. So we can control the scale with that. And then move the plane so its origin is directly beneath that 3D model. And now we can drag the white to the left, and that will increase how opaque it is. So if it's solid white, it's going to be 100% catching the shadow. So it's going to be the plain texture, whereas black is going to be the transparent area, which we'll see the background through. So I'll just tweak it a little bit until we get it how we want it. Let's disconnect the viewer by Control-Shift clicking on the principled. And now the shadow is much more clear because we've made it much more white in the middle, and we've lost that obvious transition at the edge. This will also solve all the issues I mentioned earlier. For example, indirect lighting will be calculated correctly from the ground onto the 3D object, as will reflections. And not only that, but reflections can now be in colour, whereas when we use the shadow catcher in the object properties, we could only get black and white reflections. So it does solve all the issues we mentioned earlier, and yeah, it's really easy to work with, and it also works in the viewport as well. And one thing I have noticed is hands are looking a bit empty, so what I'm going to do is drop an axe in there. Alright, so I found an axe, I'm just going to position it, and then I'm going to use the sculpt mode pose tool just to move the fingers around to wrap it around the shaft of the axe. Do the same for both hands. And then just do a little bit of touching up on these fingers to make them look more separate using the sculpt, crease mode and grab mode. Alright, so I've decided on this background. I think it looks pretty good, and I've positioned the camera how I like it. Once you've positioned the camera, by the way, just make sure you go into the end panel and disable camera to view so that you can't accidentally move the camera around. Okay, and I've noticed a bit of a problem with this model. So if you're using this one, just go into the emission up here when you've got rendered mode turned on. So go into the emission pass, and you can notice it's got emission in the material, which is not what you want. It's going to just slightly light up the surrounding areas and look a little bit weird. And if we go to the object, we're just going to disconnect whatever's connected into this emission input. So Control, right click drag, and that'll delete that. We'll do the same for the wings, just remove it. And if we go back to combined, we're going to have to make some adjustments now, because obviously it's going to be a lot darker than it was. Very straightforward. With the armor selected, we're going to just increase the brightness of the base color. So Shift A, S, RGB curve, and we'll brighten up the mid area. And just to bring a little bit of contrast back, we'll drop down another RGB curve, and we'll lower the black a little bit, and then we'll also raise the white a little bit as well. And that'll just add a little bit of that contrast back in. Zoom in and get a better look. And by the way, if it's slow to render on your machine, just always do a Control B, and you can just isolate a single area, and it's going to render rapidly then, so you can get a really close look. And just tweak things to avoid any clipping, which basically means you've turned the brightness up so high that you can't see the details in the texture. And just keep tweaking it until it looks right to you. And now we're zoomed in, we can see that there are issues with other materials, particularly on the arms. You can also use Control B in the viewport, not just the camera. But what you need to be aware of is if you're in camera mode, this is how it's going to render when you do the final render. So Control Alt B will get rid of that. But the Control B in this mode, in the view node, will remain. So you can do it that way as well. I'm just going to make a few tweaks to the skin texture. I click on the arms. I want to plug in the base color into the subsurface color, and that will allow me just to increase it a little bit more, 0.015 probably. That's just giving us a little bit more subsurface scattering, but it's not becoming too white because we've plugged in the color for the skin. Just adds a little bit more realism to the skin. Just that very subtle change in the subsurface scattering. And obviously we've also removed the emission from the wing, so we need to do the same here. So we'll copy the nodes we've set up for the armor and then paste them into the wings material, and then just make a few tweaks until it looks right. So don't forget, the left-hand side is the darker areas and the right-hand side is the brighter areas of the texture. So if I want, because these feathers were quite dark, if I want to make those a little bit lighter, I would raise this up on the left-hand side, like so. But if I want to make the brighter areas of the texture brighter, then I would make those alterations on the right-hand side of the RGB curve. This part up over here. Let's get rid of that. You see, if I bring that across, that's going to make the whiter areas brighter. So, for example, the white areas on this feather, without affecting the dark areas. And now one last thing, let's just have a quick check of this horse texture. So I want to look at the body area, not this first bit. I'll delete this now. Let's increase the subsurface a little. That should be fine. And I think we'll bring that normal up a little bit higher as well. Maybe 0.3. Now there is a pretty big issue with cycles. It can't handle normals very well. So if you had a bump node, it's going to completely mess up the shading on the object if you don't have sufficient geometry. As we'll see here, if I increase the normal and zoom in a little bit, let's just box select this. You can see we've got these white lines now all along the model, and that's actually the geometry causing artifacts with cycles. So the only thing we can do to avoid this, or the best thing to do, is to increase the subdivisions using a subdivision modifier, and that will hide all those artifacts from the view. Because there's more geometry, the bump map will work better with it. If the strength's set very low though, you can generally get away without increasing the subdivisions. It only really becomes an issue when you set the strength of the bump to be quite high. Now we'll press 0 to go back into camera mode, and then press home to fit it into the window. And I quite like that, but the armor is a little bit too bright, so let's just take that down a little bit on the contrast. So that's looking good. The next thing we're going to do is some compositing, and this is where you can really make your image pop. Before rendering and compositing, I want to turn on a few passes. So let's go over to the view layer properties on the right hand side here, and let's turn on the mist, and we'll also turn on the environment as well. And that basically means that we'll be able to adjust the environment, the HDRI background, separately if we want to. We may not want to, but it's always good to give yourself the option. And in order to do that, we'll need to make sure we turn on transparent. So let's go down in the render properties to the film section, and then turn on transparent, and you can see the HDRI now disappears, and we're just left with the ground plane. And we'll combine those in the compositor afterwards. And in order for the mist pass to work correctly, we need to set that up. So let's go into the top right hand corner in rendered view, and we'll turn on the mist pass. So we can now see the mist pass in the viewport. Go into the world settings, and under the mist pass section, just expand this, and we can change the depth and the start. So set the start to 0, and basically what we need to do is get a good gradient from black to white across the character. So let's just turn the depth down a little bit. I want the ground to become quite bright as well. And you can see we're now starting to get a decent mist effect across the character. With that done, go back to the top of the render settings and set up the samples that you want to use. I'm using Turbo Render because it renders a lot faster and gives much better results as well. If you don't have this, don't worry, you can still continue. Just have to set your own render settings in here. If you do have Turbo Render, I'm going to choose these options, very dirty, enhance the textures. That'll make sure we don't lose any texture detail, even at low samples. Optimize HDRI will reduce the memory consumption that the HDRI uses on your graphics card by up to 1 GB, and prevent fireflies will just make sure we don't get any very bright white. I may leave this off in fact, so I'm going to turn that one off, and we'll see how we go with this. Okay then, so we'll go across to the compositing workspace. We've got a compositor setup, a node tree, a very simple node tree. If you don't have this set up already, just click on Use Nodes, and that will set these two nodes up for you. If you have Turbo Tools, then don't worry about this at all. It's all going to be set up for you when you press Render. So Render, and then press Turbo Tools Render, or F12 if you don't have Turbo Tools. There we go, so that's finished rendering in about 20 seconds, excluding the scene preparation because I've got persistent data turned on, which by the way is down here. So if you go into the properties section, into the render settings, go all the way down to the bottom, we've got performance, and then in here we've got the option to turn on persistent data. Now turning this on will mean basically if you've rendered before, then you won't have to wait for the scene compilation at the beginning. So for example, this one, if I didn't have this turned on, I think to calculate the hair and things, it took around about 20 or 30 seconds. So turning that on meant it doesn't have to keep redoing that each time I rendered. So now I've finished rendering, I can turn this off, and you'll notice down here, before I turn it off, we're using 7.2 gigabytes of RAM, of VRAM in fact, on the graphics card. And that's going to be problematic. So if you try and go back to the layout and use a viewport render, and you've only got 8 gigabytes of RAM on your graphics card, then using persistent data is going to probably crash Blender, or at the very least, it's going to take a long time to start rendering, if it can at all. So always make sure, if you're using persistent data, to turn it off before you go back to viewport rendering. And as soon as I do it, if we watch, the VRAM has dropped from 7.2 down to 2.7, which will allow me now to go back to the viewport and start rendering again. Okay, so you may notice that in my case, I've got this cache node here. You don't need to worry about that if you don't have Turbo Tools. Basically, that just makes all these tools that you get with Turbo Tools for the compositor available, such as caching entire branches and publishing, temporal flicker removal if you're doing animations, so you can render animations up to 40 times faster, resaving of file output nodes without re-rendering the entire 3D viewport. So quite a few decent tools in there. But again, if you don't have it, don't worry about this node. It works basically the same as having the render layers node here. If we just plug that in, it's identical. Okay, so let's start with the compositing. The first thing we need to do is drop down a alpha overnode so we can combine the geometry and the environment. So an alpha overnode basically puts one image in front of another, providing that image in front has got alpha data. So we'll plug the image into the bottom socket. So it's always the bottom one that goes in front, and then the environment that's going to go behind it will go in the top socket. And now you can see we've got the image back as intended. So unless you've got a really high quality monitor that you've spent a couple of £1,000 on, there's a high probability that what looks good to you on your screen will look crap to everybody else. So we'll bring this up, and this is how we can avoid that issue. If we press N on the keyboard, we can see we've got the tabs on the right hand side, and we're interested in the one called scopes down at the bottom. So if you click on scopes, that's going to bring up these different scopes that we can use to help us composite the image. Now let me just briefly explain what they do. So the first one, the histogram, along the left to right is the tonal range. So we've got the darks to the bright whites, and vertical is the number of pixels within that tonal range. So we can see here, most of the pixels in this one are in this sort of mid to dark area, and that's because it's mostly grass in the scene, which is quite dark. The next one is the waveform. Now the waveform depicts 0 at the bottom, so we've got this line across the bottom there, to 100 at the top. There's a line there, quite faint. And anything that goes below 0 is going to be clamped to black. So basically 0 is black and 100 is white. Anything that goes above 100 is going to be clamped to white. So ideally, if we don't want to lose any detail, we would keep everything between the 0 to 100 range. Now we might want to overexpose a sky, for example, but we wouldn't want to overexpose, for example, the armor. Otherwise we're going to start losing detail on the armor. Let me just show you. So Shift A, S, put down an RGB curve. If I move this now, this curve represents 0 darks to 100 white, or 0 to 1. If I move the white areas down, then you'll see the waveform shows that most of the areas now are within range. So if I just push it up a little bit, if we look at the clouds, you can see we've got that detail now in the clouds. If I just mute this, it's all bright white and we've lost all the detail. So I'm going to bring that detail back. If I just zoom in on the armor and then move the white up instead, and move it across to the left, so I'm moving the bright whites now to the left, you see we've lost all that detail on the armor. And we can also look at this by going, if we just bring up another little panel, go into the properties, go into the render panel, and then go all the way to the bottom, we've got color management. So if we look under color management, we've got the view transform, which should be set to standard. So we're going to change it from standard to false color. And anything that's overexposed or that is losing data that's clipped is going to be showing in red. So let's have a zoom out. You can see most of this image is okay. But areas that show red indicate that there is clipping, particularly on this cloud area here, but also on his armour. And that means we're going to lose all that detail. And we could bring it down, instead of using the waveform here, we could bring it down until all that orange has disappeared from the armour. Keep bringing it down. And there we go, we've got no clipping now. Just a very slight amount maybe. Just bring it down a tiny bit more then. But we've also got some red under his arm. And that's where the black's been clipped. So that means that there are values going below the 0 line. As we can see here, just on the right hand side there. So this actually represents, this waveform is the image from left to right. And because the clipping on the black is here, sort of on the right hand side of the image, this is where it's showing that we're getting clipping on here, these little dots at the bottom. So to fix the dark clipping, it's very similar to fixing the white clipping. It's just in reverse basically. Now rather than messing up this one, I'm going to copy it and put this one here, and I'm going to reset it by just bringing that one back up. And I want to increase the lift. So on the curve, we've got the lift on the left, so that's the darks, and that's also the darks on here. We've got the gain at the top, so this is the white area, and we've got the gamma in the middle. So this is the gamma. If I bring that down, we're decreasing the gamma, bring it up, we're increasing the gamma. And the gamma basically just means the point in between a dark point and a light point. For example here, because we've got a point at the very darkest and the very brightest, it would be around here in the middle. So to sort this problem out, we'll just increase the lift slightly until that disappears. And it's quite difficult to do because it's very delicate. Obviously I've moved that a very tiny amount, yet we've lost a lot of contrast in the depiction of the brightness, and we want to get some of that back. So what we need to do is bring the factor all the way down until that clipping just reappears, and then very slowly increase it again until it's gone. So that's ensured we've got no clipping whatsoever in the 3D part of the image, which is important. Now, we've also got no clipping, or a very tiny amount of clipping, in the top there. So let's go back out of false color, back into standard, and if we look at the image, we've got all the detail in the clouds, got all the detail on the armor, but it's quite dark. So how do we fix the darkness? Right, so let's come back out of the image editor. To fix the darkness, or to get it much brighter without losing this data up here, what we need to do is increase the gamma. So there's a couple of ways we can do it. We can drop down a gamma node, or change its value to something like 0.8, and that's going to sort of brighten it back up just in the middle. So that's doing the same as if I just mute this, as doing this. Now I prefer to use the curve because it gives you a bit more control. So I'm going to get rid of that one, Control X. And I want to change the scope on the right hand side to be RGB, separate. So parade will give us the same thing but for each channel. Right. So we'll just increase that brightness again until we get it how we want it. And you'll notice that as I increase the brightness, let me just bring it up over here. Just add a viewer to the compositor, plug this in. As we increase the brightness, we're not losing any detail. So this is before, and then that's after. It's becoming obviously much brighter, but all the detail is still in there, just not as contrasty. And then we can fix the contrast, or bring some of that contrast back with another RGB curve. And we'll bring the dark areas down and the white areas up, and that will add the contrast back in. So we've got a nice bright image, and we've got lots of contrast, and we're not losing any data on the 3D geometry. The next thing we'll look at is how we can use colours to change the overall feel of the image. So select these, Shift P, and then put them inside a little frame, and we'll call this correction. And now we can give it a bit of a look. So Shift A, S, I'm going to use a colour balance, and we can now use the colour balance to change the overall feel of the image. So let's say, for example, I want to make a bit more bluish. We can do that. Give it a bit more of a movie sort of a look. And what you would usually do is balance this out now by going in the opposite direction on the light areas. So you notice we've got lift, gamma, and gain. So lift again is the dark areas, gamma is the mid-range, and gain is the white. So now we'll bring the gain to the opposite of the blue, which is yellow. That's going to balance that out. So I'll bring that somewhere about there. And then you can control the amount using the factor. So that's before, that's after. Probably go somewhere about there. And then just to give it a final bit of a tweak, we'll add one more RGB curve node. We'll give it a little bit of contrast in the dark tones. We'll place a pin in the mid-range so that can't move. And a bit more contrast in the bright areas. Somewhere about there. Okay, so I'm happy with that. The next thing we'll look at are a few effects. In this bottom panel, we'll scroll down to the texture area. I want to add a few textures so that we can add things like clouds and mist. I'd like to add a little bit of ground mist. So I'm going to click on new. I'm going to name this to clouds. Or in fact, let's name it mist. Then we'll change the type to clouds. And we need to bring this into the image. We need to mix it in. So we'll use a mix node. And we'll choose to mix it in using the screen method. Just similar to Photoshop or any painting application you may have used. Shift A, we need to add a texture node. And we need to specify the texture. So we're going to use the mist texture, and plug the color into the bottom here. We can control how much gets mixed in with the factor. Now what I'd like to do is control the factor so that more gets mixed in at the bottom so it appears as a ground mist than at the top. This is quite simple to do. We'll just add a new texture down here. We'll call this one gradient. We'll change it to blend, which is Blender's name for a gradient, and we want it to be vertical. We'll bring in another texture node, Shift A S, texture, select the gradient, and then plug the gradient value into the factor. Now at the moment, if we zoom in, we can see the white area is at the top and the black area is at the bottom, as we can also see over here. We need to invert that so that the clouds are at the bottom, not at the top. So what I'll do is Shift A, S, ramp, drop that in, and we'll just invert this by sliding the black to the right and then the white all the way to the left. And now you can see we've got the clouds, the mist at the bottom and nothing at the top. And we can make it control the gradient more by dragging the black to the right, and we can add a bit more contrast by dragging the white to the right. Now at the moment this is horizontal and the landscape is sort of diagonal, so we need to rotate it a little bit, and we'll do Shift A, S, a transform node, drop that in there. We're going to rotate it until it looks level with the land. Maybe somewhere about there. And then we can control the strength by changing the brightness of this left-hand side slider. So let's slide that down. And this works because obviously black feeding in here gets the top socket and the white gets the bottom socket. So by reducing the white part of the ramp, we're actually telling the mix node to use more of the top socket instead of the bottom one. So I'll reduce that till I get the look I want, maybe about there. Something like that. And we can also change the contrast using another ramp. And this will sort of give us more of contrast between the black and white areas on the cloud. Let me bring it up over here. If I drag this to the right, we're going to get bigger gaps between the white areas. So maybe something like that. And we can change the scale. If we go into the clouds, or the mist, what we call it, change the scale in here. So maybe 0.5 would be better, or maybe 0.3, something like that. And we don't have to use the original noise basis. We've got all the different methods. We've got Perlin noise. We've got all these Voronoi ones. And some that will look weird. Obviously we don't want crackle. So I'll probably go with improved Perlin. I think that looks quite good. And there we go. So that's the mist mixed in. And the last thing that I'd like to do is add a lens distortion node. So let's do Shift A, S, add the lens distortion node. And actually I've just noticed as well, we've got a bit of a problem in the top corner here where we've rotated the gradient. So we've rotated the gradient and obviously there wasn't enough image outside the render region. So it's resulting in this strange artifact. Let's just increase the scale on the transform node to 1.2 and that'll fix that. The lens distortion node then, this is basically called chromatic aberration. If I put in a value of maybe 0.2, what it does, it offsets the red, green and blue channels to give this sort of a rainbow effect around the edges of the camera's lens. We don't want it to be this intense, instead it should be quite subtle. But I've chosen this just to show this strange artifact that we've got around the edge. And that's because this is actually distorting the image. What we need to do is click on Fit, and that will fit that. It'll fit it into the render resolution. Obviously let's go with a lower value, maybe 0.02 is a more realistic value that you generally want to use. Alright, so I think for the tutorial I'll leave it there. The main point was just to show all the different concepts that we've got in the compositor, such as the color correction, color grading, and then a few small effects, and also integrating other elements like textures. And don't forget, if you'd like to support the channel, then visit 3d-illusions.co.uk, where you can either become a member or you can purchase Turbo Tools version 3, which will massively speed up your cycles renders for both still images and animations. So there we are. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.